Ethan Caldwell had spent 2 years building walls that no one could breach. Biometric locks, rotating staff, a security chief he trusted with his life. He came home early on instinct alone, no warning, no plan. The house was silent. The phones had no signal. And somewhere in the dark, armed men were waiting for a version of him that was supposed to arrive 2 days later. What saved him wasn't his money, his systems, or any of the power he had spent a lifetime accumulating. It was a hand reaching out from the shadows, and 3 quiet words from the one person in that house nobody had ever thought to watch. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. Ethan Caldwell was not a man who made mistakes. That was not arrogance talking. It was a fact, documented in board presentations and quarterly reports and the kind of newspaper profiles that made other men feel small. He had built Caldwell Industries from a regional manufacturing firm into a global enterprise worth somewhere north of $4 billion, and he had done it without a single scandal, without a single hostile press cycle, and without a single moment of genuine vulnerability. People like to say he was lucky. He preferred to think he was careful. Careful was what you became when the world tried to take everything from you. He had a routine for everything. The morning pages of 3 different newspapers, physical copies, still because he found that reading on a screen allowed him to skip too easily. 40 minutes of exercise before 7. Meals at predictable times. See, meetings blocked into the calendar with military precision, no open windows, no spontaneous additions unless he personally approved them. His executive assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hartley, who had been with him for 9 years, once told a journalist that Ethan Caldwell was the only person she had ever worked for who could make spontaneity feel pre-scheduled. He had read the quote and found it accurate rather than amusing. 2 years ago, a consortium of rival firms had attempted a coordinated hostile takeover of his company. They had moved quietly, buying shares through shell entities, planting sources inside his executive team, and setting up a proxy vote that was supposed to catch him completely off guard. It had nearly worked. Ethan still remembered the morning he found out, sitting in his car in a parking garage in downtown Chicago, reading an email on his phone that made his stomach drop. He had been 3 moves behind, and he had not even known the game had started. He recovered. He always recovered, but something changed in him after that. The ease he had once moved through the world with calcified into something harder and more watchful. He rebuilt his security infrastructure from the ground up. He hired new personnel, vetted at levels that bordered on invasive. He installed biometric access at every sensitive point of his estate and his offices. He reviewed access logs personally, twice a week, every week, without exception. The mansion outside of Geneva, Illinois, where he spent most of his personal time, had become something close to a fortress. 14 cameras covering every exterior angle. Motion sensors in the grounds. A rotating staff schedule so that no single employee ever developed a predictable routine that someone from the outside could map and exploit. A private security team led by Daniel Reeves, a former federal contractor Ethan had poached, with an offer that made Daniel's jaw go slightly slack when he heard it. Ethan trusted very few people. He trusted his systems a great deal more. The household staff numbered 11 in total, each of them vetted through background checks that went back a decade. He did not socialize with them beyond the functional courtesies of someone who understood that the people who maintained his domestic life deserved basic human acknowledgement. He knew their names. He knew their assigned roles. He did not, as a rule, I know much more than that, and he told himself this was appropriate professional distance rather than indifference. Lena Brooks had been with the household for just over 2 years. She handled the interior, daily cleaning of the main rooms, bi-monthly deep cleaning of the storage and mechanical areas, coordination with the laundry service, maintenance requests for the household fittings. She was in her early 30s, quiet in the way that certain people are quiet not from shyness, but from economy. She did not spend words she didn't need to spend. When she spoke to him, she was direct and brief. When he passed her in a hallway, she acknowledged him with a nod that managed to be neither servile nor familiar. He had noted, in the vague way one notes things without examining them, that she was unusually thorough. What things in the house that he later noticed were wrong had often already been fixed before he registered them as problems. A loose fitting in the library door, a draft coming through the seal around the east wing window. Small things, the kind of things that required not just doing your job, but actually looking at the space around you, which was why the fact that the service corridor camera had been malfunctioning for nearly 3 weeks bothered him, or should have bothered him. When the maintenance report first crossed his desk in mid-October, he had noted it, flagged it for repair, and then been pulled into back-to-back acquisition meetings that swallowed the rest of his week. By the time those meetings were done, the camera issue had slipped below the line in his mental ledger of priorities. Daniel had assured him it was an isolated hardware fault, a bad sensor, nothing more. The repair was scheduled. He had left for Singapore on a Tuesday. He had expected to return the following Friday. He landed back in Chicago on a Wednesday night instead. The decision to come home early had not been rational exactly. He had been sitting in a 45th floor conference room in Singapore, listening to a financial summary from his regional director when a number in the middle of a slide caught his attention, a variance in projected cash flow from one of his subsidiary accounts, small enough that no one had flagged it as significant. A rounding error, his regional director said, quickly moving past it. Ethan said nothing, but he took a photo of the slide on his personal phone, and that night, alone in his hotel room, he had stared at that number for a long time. It was the kind of number that only looked small if you didn't know where to look. He had seen something similar once before, right before the hostile takeover attempt. He booked the red-eye without telling anyone. Not his assistant, not his driver, not Daniel. He told himself it was because there was nothing concrete to report yet. Just a hunch, just a number. But beneath that was something rawer. If something was wrong, the last thing he wanted to do was alert the people closest to him before he knew which people he could actually trust. The car he took from O'Hare was a rental, paid in cash from a hotel ATM, driven himself. He pulled through the back gate of the estate just before midnight. The night was overcast, no moon. The kind of Midwestern autumn dark that pressed close and smelled of damp leaves and coming rain. He had driven this road hundreds of times. He knew the gate code, the curve of the private lane, the way the gravel gave way to smooth concrete under the portico. Everything was familiar. And yet, something in him, that finely calibrated instrument that the hostile takeover had sharpened into something almost uncomfortable, was already sending a low, persistent signal that he had no language for yet. The gate code worked. The biometric panel at the side entrance responded to his thumbprint. Everything was technically in order. And yet, the moment he stepped into the dim entryway of the house, something settled over him like a weight. The house was too quiet. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. But the interior lights were set to their night configuration, low, warm, automatic. Normal. The hallway ahead was empty. Normal. The security panel near the entry alcove showed a green standby light. On the surface, everything looked like a house in the ordinary quiet of a late October night. He told himself he was being paranoid, that 3 weeks of high-stakes meetings in foreign time zones had wound him too tight. He told himself the number in the Singapore slide probably had an innocent explanation. He called out, "Hello?" His voice moved through the house and came back to him in silence. That was wrong. There was always at least one member of the night staff on duty, someone at the desk near the kitchen, someone doing a corridor check. He had never once come home to a completely empty ground floor. He stood in the entryway and listened. And all he could hear was the soft, low hum of the climate control system and, faintly, the sound of his own breathing. He reached for his phone to call Daniel and felt a cold jolt when the screen showed no signal. Not low signal. 0. He moved to the window. Nothing. He moved back toward the door. Nothing. The estate had a cellular booster hardwired into the structure. He had insisted on it himself, specifically because he never wanted to be in a situation where his communication was cut off. For that system to be down, something would have had to go wrong with the power routing, or someone would have had to switch it off deliberately. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking deeper into the house. He kept his pace controlled, though every instinct in his body was now fully awake. He checked the kitchen. Empty. Cleared. Nothing out of place, but the overhead light that usually stayed on through the night had been turned off. He checked the security panel near the dining room, the secondary one, and found the screen dark. The panel was never off. It ran on a dedicated circuit. He was trying to figure out if there was a logical explanation when he turned down the service corridor. The service corridor ran along the back of the ground floor, a narrow, utilitarian passage that connected the kitchen loading area to the laundry room, and from there to the staff stairwell. It was the least glamorous part of the house, plain painted walls and industrial flooring, lit by a single strip of fluorescent light that had been replaced so many times the fixture had developed a faint, intermittent flicker. This was also the corridor where the camera had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. He was about halfway down it when the hand came out of the dark. It closed over his mouth from the side, firm and fast, and simultaneously he felt himself pulled sharply backward into the alcove beside the laundry room door. His whole body reacted before his mind could catch up, arms coming up, weight shifting to throw the hold. But the person behind him was already whispering, lips close to his ear, voice so low it was barely sound at all. "Don't speak. Don't move. They're inside." He stopped. It was not the words alone that stopped him. It was the voice, controlled even in its fear, stripped of everything except raw, unembellished warning. He knew the voice. He placed it in half a second. Lena. Lena Brooks, one of his household staff. A woman he had employed for the better part of 2 years, and whom he could not have honestly claimed to know beyond her efficiency and her quiet reliability. He stayed still. She held the position for another 3 seconds, listening, before she slowly released her hand from his mouth and moved to face him in the dark. He could barely see her. She was wearing dark clothing, her natural hair pulled back, and her eyes were wide and sharp and fixed on him with an intensity he had never seen from her in the course of normal household interaction. "There are men in the house," she breathed. "Armed, at least 3 that I've seen. I don't know all the entry points they used." She paused. "I didn't know who to call. I didn't know who was safe to call." He looked at her for a moment. "How long?" he whispered. "I noticed something wrong around 9, 2 hours ago. I hid." He processed that. She had been alone in this house, aware of armed intruders, for 2 hours. And she had not panicked, had not tried to run blindly for an exit. She had hidden and waited. From somewhere above them, a floor creaked. Both of them went completely still. The footstep was deliberate, slow, the kind of step someone makes when they're moving with intention through a space they know. It crossed the ceiling above the corridor, paused, then moved again toward the far side of the house, not searching, not hurrying. Waiting. They stayed exactly where they were for 30 seconds after the footsteps stopped. Neither of them moved. Neither spoke. Ethan counted his own heartbeats to keep himself focused, a habit he had developed years ago in rooms where he needed to stay sharp while everything around him was trying to pull him off center. When he finally risked leaning toward Lena, he kept his voice at the very bottom of a whisper. "How many did you actually see?" "2 in the main corridor upstairs, 1 near the west wing door." She hesitated. "There may be more. The ones I saw were moving in a pattern, like they were assigned positions." He absorbed that. Assigned positions meant coordination. Coordination meant this was not opportunistic. He pulled out his phone again, still no signal, and tried to open the security application that linked to the estate's camera network. The app loaded, then hung on a gray screen, cycling endlessly, unable to connect. He showed her the screen. She nodded, unsurprised, as if she had already accounted for this. "The system has been locked," she said. "I tried accessing it from the kitchen panel around 9:15. The screen came on, but it wouldn't respond to input, not frozen, locked, like someone had taken administrative control from somewhere else." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. To override the estate security system remotely, you needed more than a password. You needed credential-level access that only 3 people in his organization held: his personal IT director, Daniel Reeves, and Ethan himself. This was not a hack from some external actor stumbling through a firewall. This was someone who had been given the keys and had quietly made a copy. "Tell me what else you noticed," he said, "before tonight." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding how much to say and how quickly. Then she seemed to settle something in herself. This past week, 2 of the regular security guards asked to swap their shifts, separately. Different days, different reasons. One said a family matter, the other said a doctor's appointment. "It happens. I didn't think much of it at first." She paused. "But then I noticed that the guards who covered those swapped shifts were both new additions. People I hadn't seen before, but who seemed to already know the house layout." "You noticed that?" "I pay attention," she said simply, and there was no pride in it, just the plain fact. "The cameras," he said. 3 of them were marked as under maintenance this week. The east corridor, the service entrance, and the rear garden angle. He had seen the maintenance schedule in a summary Daniel forwarded him before the Singapore trip. 3 cameras in a 7-day window. He had not thought to question it. Lena was watching him. The rear garden camera being down means someone can move between the perimeter gate and the service entrance without being recorded. He stared at her. She was right. He had looked at those 3 camera outages as a maintenance matter. She had just told him they formed a corridor, a blind path from the outside of the estate to the inside. He needed to move. Standing still in this alcove was not a plan. It was just delay. "Do you know the passage routes in this house?" he asked. "The staff passages?" "Yes," she said. "I know most of them." "There's a secondary route that runs parallel to the main ground floor hall. It connects to the east stairwell without passing through any of the main rooms." "Show me." She moved first, and he followed, staying close, watching her navigate the dark with a confidence that told him she had mentally mapped this house far beyond what her job description required. She moved low, slow, with her weight distributed carefully to avoid making the floor speak. He matched her pace as best he could. The secondary passage was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls. They moved through it in silence, past a junction that branched toward the wine cellar, past the mechanical room where the climate control system hummed steadily, providing just enough ambient noise to cover their footsteps. Halfway down, Lena stopped. She put her hand back, pressing lightly against his chest. "Stop," and tilted her head slightly to the right. Voices, low, but audible through the thin wall that separated the passage from what he calculated was the back pantry. 2 voices, male. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. "Confirmed for tomorrow night. Window opens at 11, closes at 1. That's the time we have." A pause. The second voice, quieter. "He lands Friday afternoon. Cars booked, route is set. There won't be any deviation." "There better not be. This doesn't work if the timing is off." Another pause, longer this time. "And the rest of the staff?" "They won't be an issue. The schedule's been adjusted." The voices moved, footsteps retreating, and the pantry went quiet. Ethan stood in the passage and did not move for a long moment. His hands, he noticed, they had curled into fists at his sides without his making a conscious decision to do so. They thought he was landing on Friday. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be on the other side of the world right now, sleeping in his Singapore hotel room, completely unaware. He was supposed to walk into whatever they had prepared for him on Friday night, like a man walking into a room without knowing the floor had been cut away. His early return had put him inside a plan that was already in motion, in a house that had been configured around his absence, which meant everything they had set up was currently operating on a timeline that did not include him being present and aware right now. Lena turned to look at him in the dark. Her expression was not panicked. It was measured, careful, and behind it was something that looked like it had already processed what she just heard and moved on to what came next. "They're waiting for a specific time," she said, barely audible. "This isn't a robbery." "No," he agreed. "They're waiting for you, the version of you who comes home on Friday and doesn't know any of this." He nodded once. She let that sit for exactly one beat, then, "We need to keep moving." They continued through the passage, emerging into a junction near the base of the east stairwell. From here, Ethan knew, they could access the lower level where the server room and the secondary security infrastructure were located. The server room, he had barely thought about it in months. It was a holdover from an earlier phase of the estate's security setup, before the primary system had been upgraded. Lena had mentioned the kitchen panel was locked, but the server room ran on a different circuit, a legacy system that had never been folded into the main upgrade because the contractor who managed the integration had flagged it as redundant. Redundant! Which might mean whoever had taken control of the primary system had not bothered with it. "The server room," he said. She looked at him. "Off the mechanical corridor." "You know it." "I've cleaned it," she said. "Twice a month. It's a small room, one access point. The panel is mounted on the left wall, about shoulder height. Can you get us there without using the main corridors?" She thought for a moment, not hesitating theatrically, but actually thinking, running the map of the house in her head with the same systematic attention she apparently applied to everything else. "Yes," she said, "but we have to go through the laundry junction and then backtrack along the south mechanical run. It adds distance, maybe 8 minutes. Then we have 8 minutes. She moved. He followed her through the laundry junction, down a low-ceilinged run that smelled of concrete and pipe insulation, past the water heater units and the electrical boards, until she stopped at a plain gray door marked with a faded label that read, "Server/secondary access." She tried the handle. It opened. The room inside was small, just as she had said, barely enough space for 2 people to stand without touching. The panel on the left wall was dark, but when Ethan reached past her and pressed the power toggle at the base, the screen came on with a low, steady glow. It was running. Old interface, slow but running. And it was not locked. He exhaled once, slow and controlled, and started pulling up the access logs. The data came through in chunks, incomplete, because this system only captured a fraction of the estate's full camera network. The older cameras, the ones that hadn't been replaced in the upgrade, but what it had was enough. Ethan scrolled through the entries, timestamps running backward, and he began to see it. A pattern of access, repeated over several weeks, using a high-level administrative credential. The same credential over and over at hours that did not correspond to any scheduled security check. He scrolled to the credential identifier and read it. He read it twice. Then he straightened up and stood very still. Beside him, Lena was watching the screen too. She did not need to ask. She could read. The credential belonged to Daniel Reeves. "He's the chief of security," Ethan said, more to himself than to her, the words coming out flat and quiet. "I know who he is," she said. Ethan turned to look at her. There was something in his expression that he was not able to fully contain. Not shock exactly. He had been in business long enough that betrayal was not a foreign concept, but this was Daniel. Daniel, who had been in his employ for 6 years. Daniel, who had rebuilt the entire security architecture of this estate. Daniel, who Ethan had trusted not merely as an employee, but as someone who occupied a near-personal layer of his life, who knew his schedule and his vulnerabilities, and the exact combination of factors that made him most exposed. Felina was watching him with the particular calm of someone who had learned a long time ago that being right about a bad thing did not make it any less bad. She did not say anything. She gave him the moment. He took it. Then, from somewhere in the upper part of the house, a door. Footsteps in the main hall, moving with purpose, unhurried but definite, heading in a direction that was not away from the service wing. They both heard it at the same moment. Lena reached past him and turned the server panel back off. The room went dark. She put her hand on the door and held it, not closed, not open, just controlled, and they stood there in the dark, while the footsteps in the corridor above tracked slowly across the ceiling above them, then stopped. A voice muffled through the ceiling and walls said something Ethan could not make out. Then, nothing. Then the footsteps started again, moving away. Neither of them breathed until the sound had fully faded. In the dark, Ethan became aware of how small the room was, how close they were standing, and how, in the space of a few hours, the entire structure of his life, the careful architecture of trust and control and monitored access that he had spent 2 years building, had been revealed as something that someone else had quietly hollowed out from the inside. He became aware of something else, too. He had come home tonight because of a number in a slide, because of instinct, because of the particular kind of paranoia that the hostile takeover attempt had installed in him 2 years ago, the kind he had sometimes resented for what it cost him in terms of ease and rest and the basic comfort of trusting people. Tonight, that paranoia had kept him alive, and the woman standing next to him in the dark, who had hidden alone in this house for 2 hours, who had mapped its passages and read its patterns and grabbed him in the dark to stop him from walking into something he couldn't see. She had kept him alive, too. He thought about that for a moment with the particular clarity that only comes when something strips everything else away. He had spent 2 years rebuilding an infrastructure of trust and control, and somewhere in that process he had made the fundamental error of trusting the wrong person with the keys. That error had not come from carelessness. It had come from the assumption that certain loyalties were self-evidencing, that a man who had rebuilt your security and been rewarded generously for it had no reason to become the instrument of your destruction. He had been wrong, and it was a woman he had never really looked at, who had never been invited to sit at a board table, who had never been consulted about anything beyond the condition of his floors, who had seen what his entire security apparatus had missed. He did not know yet how deep this went. He did not know who was above Daniel, or what the full shape of the plan was, or how far into his organization the corruption had reached. He did not know if the number in the Singapore slide was connected, or if it was a coincidence, or if whoever was behind this had been laying groundwork in his finances as well as his household. What he knew was that he was standing in a server room in his own house, in the dark, with a woman he had employed for 2 years and barely spoken to, and that she was currently the only person on the property he was certain he could trust. That was not nothing. That, in fact, was everything. He leaned toward her in the dark. "We're not leaving," he said quietly. She turned her head toward him, and even in the near-total darkness, he could read the question in her expression. "Not until we know exactly what this is," he said, "and who is behind it." A pause. He could hear her processing it, weighing it, not immediately agreeing, but thinking it through with the same measured care she had applied to everything else tonight. "Then we need to be smart," she said, "because right now, smart is the only thing we have." He nodded, and in the dark, him in the smallest and most overlooked room of his $4 billion estate, with the access logs of his own betrayal still fresh on a dusty screen, Ethan Caldwell made a decision that had nothing to do with power or control or the levers he was accustomed to pulling. He decided to follow her lead. The server room was too small to pace in, and Ethan was not a man who paced anyway. He stood with his back against the wall beside the door, arms crossed, and looked at the dark screen where Daniel's credential string had been sitting 2 minutes ago, like a sentence he could not unread. Lena was watching him, not with sympathy, and not with the careful blankness of a person who had decided it was safer not to have an expression. She was watching him the way someone watches a structure they are not sure will hold, not hoping it falls, but preparing for the possibility. He became aware of what that look meant. She had been alone in this house with armed men for 2 hours. She had hidden. She had calculated. She had made a decision to trust him the moment he walked through that door, and now she was waiting to see whether that decision had been correct. He owed her something honest in return. "You could have run," he said. "When you first heard them, you could have gotten out and called someone from outside." "I thought about it," she said, "for about 30 seconds. What stopped you?" She considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things, not performing thoughtfulness, but actually doing it. "I didn't know what I was running into. I didn't know who outside this house was safe either, and I didn't know where you were. If you came home and walked into this without any warning," she paused, "I couldn't leave without at least trying." He nodded once. Then, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to ask it." She met his eyes. "Then ask." "You noticed the shift swaps, the cameras, the behavior changes among the staff. You noticed all of that over a week, maybe more." He kept his voice level. "Why didn't you report it?" The question sat between them in the small, dark room. She did not flinch from it. "I noticed pieces," she said, "not a complete picture. A shift swap isn't a crime. A camera under maintenance isn't a crime. A guard who seems a little different this week, that's not something you bring to the head of security." She let that land a moment. Especially when you're not sure the head of security isn't the problem. He absorbed that. "You suspected Daniel." "I suspected someone with authority," she said carefully. "I didn't have a name. I had a feeling, and feelings from someone in my position." She stopped. "Let's just say I've learned to be very sure before I say anything out loud to people who can decide my credibility doesn't count." He did not respond immediately. There was something in what she had just said that required sitting with, and he was honest enough with himself to sit with it rather than move past it. She had been watching the same house he lived in, noticing things he missed, and she had made a calculated decision not to report it upward because she did not trust that reporting upward would be safe. She had been right. And that rightness said something about the world she operated in that had nothing to do with tonight specifically, and everything to do with what tonight was built on top of. "All right," he said finally, "tell me what else you know." She told him. Over the past 3 weeks, she said, she had noticed a particular pattern in who was moving through which parts of the house and when. 2 of the regular security guards had been quietly shifted off the overnight rotation. Their replacements, the men she hadn't recognized, seemed to know the layout of the service sections too well for people who were supposedly new. One of them had walked through the storage corridor twice in a single afternoon without any apparent purpose. She had pressed herself into the laundry room doorway both times and watched him. And both times he had stopped at the junction near the server room and stood there for a moment as if confirming something before turning back. She paused there, and something shifted in her posture, a slight loosening, as if she were deciding to give him more than just the operational facts. "Where I grew up," she said, "you learned to read a neighborhood by its rhythms. You knew who belonged on which corner and at what time. You knew when something was off before you could name why it was off. A car parked 3 houses down that was never there before. A face you didn't recognize walking a route that didn't make sense for where they were supposedly going. She glanced at him briefly. This house has rhythms too. I've been learning them for 2 years. When the rhythm changes, really changes. Not just fluctuates. You feel it before you see it. He listened to that. She had grown up somewhere that taught her threat recognition not as a professional skill, but as a survival necessity. Whatever specific neighborhood that was, whatever specific circumstances had shaped it, the skill itself had transferred, from reading streets to reading hallways, from watching corners to watching corridors. And she had applied it here with the same quiet, unpublicized diligence that she applied to everything else in this house. He thought about what it meant that this kind of knowledge had been present in his household for 2 years, and he had never once thought to access it. She also told him about the office. 2 days ago, when she came in to clean, how the door had been standing open, not unusual in itself, but the small decorative clock on the shelf near the window had been moved several inches from its usual position. She had moved it back without thinking much of it at the time. Now she was thinking about it carefully. The clock, Ethan said. It's solid brass. Heavy. You'd move it if you were placing something behind it and needed to access the wall behind the shelf. He thought about the layout of that shelf. The wall behind the clock sat directly adjacent to the air return vent, the largest vent opening in the office, the one that ran parallel to the entire back wall and connected to the main HVAC channel threading through the upper floor. A small device placed inside that vent would capture audio from every corner of the room. Every call he made from that desk. Every conversation held behind that closed door. "We need to get up there," he said. "Not yet." She shook her head, firm but not dismissive. "Upper floor is where most of them are positioned. If we go up now without a clear route, we walk straight into them." He wanted to argue. He could feel the pull of it, the need to move, to see, to confirm and act on something concrete. But he had already seen tonight what happened when that pull overtook his thinking. He had walked into this house without caution, without alerting anyone, without a plan, and the only reason he was still standing in this room was because someone else's caution had stopped him at the door. "What do you suggest?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the impression she had already been thinking 3 moves ahead while he was still catching up to the current one. "The backup system gave us the access logs, but there's something else in this room." She moved to the panel and pressed the power toggle again, the screen coming back up in its low, steady glow. She navigated through the old interface with more confidence than he would have expected from someone who had never been tasked with operating it, but then she had cleaned this room bi-monthly, and she watched things. She scrolled past the access logs to a secondary folder labeled Archive. Partial feed. "This system captured footage from the older cameras," she said, "before the upgrade. The East Corridor camera that was supposedly under maintenance, it's registered to the old network, not the new one. Which means it may have kept recording even while the primary system listed it as offline." He leaned in beside her. She pulled the feed. The footage was low resolution, grainy, with a timestamp running in faded numbers at the bottom corner. She scrolled back through it. 9 days, 8 days, and then she stopped. There was a figure in the East Corridor. The timestamp read 3 a.m, 6 days ago. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, carrying something small in one hand. It stopped outside Ethan's office door, used a key card to enter, and disappeared inside for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When it emerged, it was empty-handed. Ethan stared at the figure. The resolution was poor enough that the face was not immediately readable. But the build, the posture, the specific way the figure carried itself, shoulders set, our weight slightly back, that particular economy of movement that came from years of professional training. "That's Daniel," he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought so too." He straightened up. Something had shifted in him, not just the confirmation of what the access logs had already suggested, but the visual reality of it. Daniel, in his house at 3 a.m, planting something in his office. Daniel, who had overseen the installation of every security measure in this building. Daniel, who had reviewed the camera schedules and the guard rotations and the access credential lists. All of it, the entire architecture of Ethan's safety, had been designed by the person now systematically dismantling it. "He knew every blind spot," Ethan said, "because he created them." Lena said nothing. She let him arrive at it completely. The irony was almost too large to hold. Ethan had rebuilt his security infrastructure from scratch after the hostile takeover attempt specifically to prevent this kind of inside betrayal. He had hired Daniel because Daniel was the best, because Daniel had credentials and references, and a reputation that had been independently verified at multiple levels. And Daniel had taken that trust and used it the way a locksmith uses a key, not to protect, but to open. "The safest person," Lena said quietly, "is always the one no one questions." He looked at her. "You said that," he said, and he realized she had said it now because she had thought it days ago. She had known it, or suspected it, before tonight. She had just had no way to prove it to anyone who would have listened. From somewhere in the house, they both heard something that made them go still. Not footsteps this time, a door, a heavy door, not a hollow interior one, the kind of sound that meant an exterior access point or one of the reinforced interior doors in the main wing. It opened and closed once, deliberately. Then silence again. They looked at each other in the dim glow of the screen. "Someone's moving into position," she said, low. "We need to get to the upper floor," he said. "Not to the office, not yet, but somewhere we can see what's happening without being seen." She thought for 2 seconds. "The observation gallery above the main staircase. There's a service access panel behind the linen closet on the upper landing. It opens into a walkway above the gallery. You can see most of the main floor from up there without being visible from below." "You've been up there?" "I cleaned up there," she said simply. "Come on." He turned off the panel screen and they moved back into the dark. They reached the east stairwell without incident. Lena went first, as she had been going first all night, and Ethan followed close behind her, one hand trailing the wall to orient himself in the dark. She moved with a focused quietness that he had stopped being surprised by and started simply relying on. Every turn she made was deliberate. Every pause before a junction told him she was listening before she committed to direction. He began to understand that she had been doing this kind of careful navigation for a long time, not in mansions, not in the context of armed intruders, but in the broader practice of moving through spaces where the wrong step had consequences. She had grown up somewhere that taught her to read rooms before she walked into them. She had carried that skill here into this house, and for 2 years it had made her exceptional at a job that most people treated as background. Tonight, it was keeping him breathing. He found himself thinking about what she had said in the server room, about having a feeling and knowing that feelings from someone in her position didn't count for much with people who held authority. He had employed her for 2 years and had never once asked her opinion about anything that wasn't directly related to the condition of a surface or the scheduling of a maintenance call. And she had been watching his house, reading its patterns, noticing things that his trained, credentialed, well-compensated chief of security had either missed or deliberately ignored, and she had kept those observations to herself because she had correctly calculated that bringing them forward would be futile. No one would have listened. And if the wrong person had found out she was paying that kind of attention, she would have become a problem to be quietly solved. She had known that. She had factored it into every careful, silent observation she made. And she had stayed anyway and watched and waited until the moment when her knowledge was the only thing standing between him and a staged death in his own home. There was something in that which required more than he could give it right now, in a darkened stairwell with armed men 1 floor above him. He filed it away in the part of his mind that held the things that mattered, but he didn't have the luxury of sitting with it yet. The upper landing was dim, lit only by the ambient glow filtering through the high windows facing the exterior grounds. The grounds themselves were dark. The external lights had been switched off at some point in the last hour, another deliberate choice, another thing someone with administrative access had done to shape the environment around a plan that was supposed to unfold without witnesses. Lena moved directly to the linen closet at the far end of the corridor and opened it without hesitation. The interior smelled of clean cotton and cedar. She pushed past the folded linens on the lower shelf and pressed against the back wall in a specific spot. 2 knocks, light, finding the hollow, then a firm push that released a hidden latch. A panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage no wider than a person's shoulders. She went in. He followed, pulling the closet door shut behind him. The passage ran behind the wall of the upper gallery, and within a few feet it opened onto a low walkway. Barely 3 feet of clearance between the floor and the sloping ceiling, but wide enough to navigate if you stayed low. The walkway ran parallel to the gallery railing, and every 6 feet or so there was a decorative vent cut into the wall that corresponded to the ornamental ironwork on the gallery's interior face. Through these vents, the central staircase hall below was visible in fragments, angled slices of the marble floor, the sweep of the main banister, the chandelier hanging dark above the entry. Lena settled into a crouch near the first vent and gestured for him to take the second one. They were a few feet down. He moved into position and looked through. The main hall below was occupied. 3 men were visible from his angle, 2 positioned near the base of the staircase, 1 near the entrance to the east corridor. They were dressed in dark clothing, and each of them carried equipment that was unmistakably professional. Not improvised gear, not the kind of thing someone picks up at short notice. This was coordinated, outfitted, organized, body-worn radios, tactical vests, sidearms visible at the hip. The men held their positions with the particular stillness of people who had been trained to wait without fidgeting, without checking phones, without the subtle restlessness of civilians uncomfortable with silence. Ethan looked at them and understood something with complete chilling clarity. This was not a small operation. This was not 2 or 3 men running a side scheme for personal gain. What he was looking at represented resources, coordination, and time. Weeks of groundwork at minimum, possibly months. The kind of operation that required funding, logistics, and someone above Daniel who had the authority and the reach to set all of it in motion. Then, from the corridor that led to the security control room, a 4th figure emerged. He recognized Daniel from the shape of him before the man stepped fully into the available light. The broad-shouldered build, the deliberate stride, the way he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had long ago made peace with being the one who gives orders rather than receives them. Ethan had admired that quality once, had interpreted it as competence. But now he watched it and felt something cold move through him. Daniel walked into the center of the main hall and spoke to the 2 men at the base of the staircase in a voice low enough that Ethan could not make out specific words at first, only the cadence, calm and instructional, the voice of someone running through a checklist. One of the men gestured toward the upper floor. Daniel shook his head, said something short, and the man nodded. Then Daniel reached into his jacket, produced a phone, looked at the screen, typed a brief response, and put it away. He spoke again, and this time the acoustics of the vaulted hall carried the words upward with enough clarity to land. Confirmed for tomorrow, which means tonight stays quiet and contained. A pause. He was listening to something through an earpiece. He was supposed to land Friday afternoon. The window doesn't open until then. Another pause. No, the board vote is the mechanism. Once he's removed from the equation, the proxy transfers automatically. That's the entire point of the timeline. Ethan felt the air leave his chest, removed from the equation. The phrase had a careful, administrative quality to it, the kind of language you chose when the thing you were describing was too direct to name plainly. He was going to be removed from the equation, not legally outmaneuvered, not publicly discredited, removed. And the board vote was the mechanism that would convert his removal into a transfer of control, which meant someone on his board was positioned, waiting, ready to step into the vacuum the moment it was created. Daniel spoke again, slightly louder. Clearer. Stage it right, and no one questions it. He's a high-stress man, isolated lifestyle. The circumstances right themselves. A staged death. A medical emergency. The kind of thing that happened to powerful men who lived under pressure and didn't let anyone close enough to notice they were struggling. The kind of thing that generated sympathy and closed questions rather than opening them. Beside him in the narrow passage, Lena had gone completely still. She had heard every word. Her jaw was set, her eyes forward, and her expression had moved past fear into something harder, the look of a person who had already made their decision about what came next and was simply waiting for the moment to act on it. He pulled back from the vent carefully, and they began inching back toward the access panel. But they were almost there when his foot caught the edge of a low-lying brace along the walkway floor. The sound it made was small, a soft, hollow knock, the kind of thing that wouldn't register in a noisy room. But the main hall below was not a noisy room. It was a room full of trained men in a state of active alertness, and one hollow knock in a passage above the gallery was exactly the kind of anomaly they were listening for. From below, Daniel's voice cut through the air, no longer quiet, no longer instructional. The calm was gone. In its place was something sharper and more dangerous, a man who had just realized his timeline had been disrupted and was responding with the speed and decisiveness of someone for whom disruption was simply a problem with a solution. Check the upper level. Footsteps immediately, fast and purposeful, heading for the stairs. Lena was already moving, pulling the access panel open and sliding through without a sound. Ethan was right behind her. She pulled the panel shut behind them, and they pressed back through the linen closet and out into the corridor in under 10 seconds. But the sound of boots on the marble staircase was already climbing toward them. There was no time to calculate. Lena grabbed his arm and pulled him left, away from the staircase, down the corridor toward the back wing. They moved fast now, past the guest rooms, past the closed door of the study, turning into a servants' junction at the end of the hall that opened onto a secondary staircase leading down. This staircase was plain and uncarpeted, and their footsteps on the bare wood would have been audible to anyone within earshot. But speed mattered more than stealth now. The window where stealth could save them had closed. They were halfway down when a door above them slammed open. The sound of it, heavy, forceful, the sound of someone not being careful anymore because being careful was no longer the priority, rang through the stairwell and bounced off every surface. Then came the boots, plural now, multiple men responding to the signal, moving to cover the building in a sweep pattern that Ethan recognized even in his current state of controlled panic as exactly the kind of thing Daniel would have planned for. A contingency within the contingency. If the subject became aware, if the operation was disrupted before the scheduled window, there was a protocol. There was always a protocol with Daniel. That was the thing about having the best man available. When he turned on you, you were facing someone who had thought of everything. A voice, Daniel's voice, filled the upper floor with words that carried down the stairwell and settled over them like a verdict. Find them. He's here. And then the lights came on, not gradually, not in sections, all of them simultaneously, every corridor and room in the mansion flooding with cold, flat brightness that obliterated every shadow they had been moving through. Ethan's eyes contracted painfully. Beside him, Lena kept moving without breaking stride, squinting but not stopping, because stopping was the one thing that couldn't happen. Doors began locking. Not all of them. The system was being engaged selectively, tactically, sealing off specific corridors and rooms to funnel them in a particular direction. Ethan heard the heavy mechanical click of the reinforced door at the base of the main staircase, then the door to the east wing corridor, then the side exit near the kitchen. Each click was another option removed, another path closed. Whoever was managing the system remotely, and it would be Daniel, it would have to be Daniel because Daniel had built this, was trying to herd them somewhere specific. Lena recognized it at the same moment he did. "They're trying to box us in," she said, not stopping, keeping her voice barely above a breath. "I know." He looked at the doors ahead of them. The door at the far end of the ground floor corridor, the one that led to the mechanical wing, the one that was on a separate circuit from the main security system because the HVAC required independent emergency access, was still unlit, still unlocked. "There," he said. She saw it. She was already turning. They moved through the corridor at a pace that was as close to running as they could manage while staying below the level of sound that would give their exact location away. Behind them, somewhere in the upper floor, boots were moving in an organized pattern, not frantic, not disorganized, but methodical, systematic, room by room. Daniel was not panicking. Daniel was managing a problem with the same cool competence he had always shown, except now that competence was being applied to hunting the man who had trusted him most. Ethan thought, as he ran through his own house, about trust, about what it cost, and what it made possible, and what it left you exposed to when it was placed in the wrong hands. He had rebuilt an entire structure of protection around himself 2 years ago, and he had put Daniel at the center of it, and Daniel had hollowed it out from the inside while smiling at him across a conference table and reviewing his security protocols and assuring him that everything was in order. Everything had been in order. Daniel's order? Not his. They reached the mechanical wing door. Lena pushed through first. The door swung shut behind them, and the sound of the main house receded, muffled now, filtered through insulated walls and the steady drone of the HVAC units. In here, there were no cameras. The overhead lighting was maintenance level, dim, industrial, running on a separate timer. The air smelled of metal and dust and the particular institutional smell of large mechanical systems running in enclosed spaces. They pressed their backs to the wall on either side of the door and stood there for 5 full seconds, catching their breath, listening. From the other side of the door, footsteps, getting closer, then stopping. A long pause, then moving away. Lena exhaled, very quietly. The sound of it in the dim room was almost nothing. "We bought a few minutes," she said. "We need more than minutes," he said. "We need a plan." She looked at him steadily in the low light. "Then we make one." And Ethan Caldwell, standing in the mechanical heart of his own home, surrounded on all sides by men his own security chief had planted, with every exit being methodically sealed, looked at the woman beside him and understood something he had been slow to understand all night. That he was not going to get out of this because of his money or his authority or his carefully constructed systems of control. He was going to get out of this, if he got out of this, because of her. Because she had seen what no one else saw, acted when no one else acted, and had not once made a move that was anything less than exactly right. He owed her more than he could calculate right now. But first, they had to survive. They had bought themselves a few minutes in the mechanical wing, hidden behind the drone of the HVAC units, while Boots swept the corridors on the other side of the door. But both of them knew that minutes were not a plan, and without a plan, minutes were just a delay before the same outcome arrived slightly later. Lena spoke first. "They're sweeping floor by floor," she said, keeping her voice low against the ambient hum of the equipment around them. "Which means they'll reach this section within 10, maybe 15 minutes. Daniel knows the layout of this house better than anyone." "Better than you?" Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly. "He knows it from blueprints and system schematics. I know it from being inside it every day for 2 years. She looked at him. "Those aren't the same thing." She was right. A blueprint told you where rooms were and how they connected. It did not tell you that the second supply closet in the east corridor had a door that didn't latch properly and had to be held from the inside to stay shut. It did not tell you that the old dumbwaiter shaft running from the kitchen sublevel to the second floor had never been sealed during the renovation because the contractor had marked it as non-functional and the follow-up inspection missed it. It did not tell you that the laundry junction floor had a section of hollow subflooring near the drain stack that made a distinct sound if you stepped on it, a sound that could either betray your position or, if you knew about it, be used deliberately to send someone in the wrong direction. Lena knew all of those things. She had been learning them the way you learned anything that mattered, by showing up, paying attention, and never once assuming that the invisible details were beneath notice. "There's a service elevator," she said, "original to the house, older than the security system overhaul. Oh, it runs from the kitchen sublevel to the second floor utility space near the linen storage. Daniel's system won't have a live feed from inside the shaft. The elevator was marked non-essential during the camera installation, and the interior was never wired." Ethan processed that. "If we can get to the kitchen sublevel without being intercepted." "There's a way, but we need to move now, before the sweep reaches the ground floor west section." They moved. She took him through the back of the mechanical wing, past the water handling units and the secondary electrical panels, to a door marked Kitchen Services, Staff Only, that opened into a short descending passage. The passage smelled of concrete and cold air and the faint residue of industrial cleaning products. It was completely unlit, and they navigated it in total darkness. Lena's hand finding the wall and guiding them along it with the confident touch of someone who had walked this route many times while carrying things. At the bottom, the passage opened into the kitchen, sublevel, a low-ceilinged storage area housing dry goods, wine racks, and the kind of large-scale catering equipment that a house like this required for the events Ethan hosted 3 or 4 times a year. The space was quiet, undisturbed, and for a moment, in the absolute stillness of it, Ethan felt a strange, compressed sensation, as if everything above them, the armed men, the locked corridors, the lights blazing through every room of his home, belonged to a different reality. And this cool, dark basement was the only honest place left in the building. The service elevator was in the far corner, behind a rack of folding event tables. But it was small, barely enough space for 2 people and a loaded cart, and its mechanism was old enough that the doors opened manually rather than automatically. Lena pulled the outer gate open and they stepped in. "It's slow," she said, "and it makes noise. Once we start moving, anyone near the second floor utility room will hear it. Then we need to be out of the shaft before they trace it." She pulled the inner gate. The elevator began to rise. It was slow, exactly as she had warned, a grinding, creaking ascent that felt in the silence of the shaft like the loudest thing either of them had ever done. Ethan stood with his back against the wall of the cab and kept his breathing steady and deliberate, the way he had kept it in every high-stakes room he had ever sat in, the kind of breathing that was not calm exactly, but was a performance of calm sustained long enough to produce the real thing. Halfway up the shaft, they heard it. A shout from somewhere on the main floor, then rapid movement, then, closer than comfortable, the sound of a door being thrown open 2 rooms away from the utility space, above them. The elevator kept climbing. It reached the second floor and stopped with a soft mechanical shudder. Lena pushed the inner gate open in one smooth movement, and they stepped out into the utility space, a narrow room filled with shelving units and cleaning supply carts, and she pulled the gate shut behind them just as the sound of boots entered the corridor on the other side of the utility room door. They pressed flat against the shelving on either side of the door and did not breathe. The footsteps slowed outside, stopped. A pause that stretched for what felt like much longer than it was. Then the boots moved on, continuing down the corridor, growing fainter. Ethan released the breath he had been holding in a long, controlled exhale that he kept completely silent. Beside him, Lena was already scanning the utility room, already thinking forward. She was not a woman who spent time on relief. She moved through it and kept going. "We got separated briefly when the main corridor locked," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, as if running a mental inventory. "If they're sweeping by section, they'll double back on this floor within a few minutes. Then we don't stay." "No," she looked at him. "But before we move again, there's something I need to tell you." He waited. "Earlier tonight, before you arrived, I wasn't only hiding. I was watching." She kept her voice even and precise. "Around 10 o'clock, before the signal went dead on the internal system, I saw Daniel in the east corridor near your study. He was on a call, not on his radio, a personal phone, the kind you use when you don't want the call logged anywhere connected to your employer's systems." She paused. "He said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, 'She wants confirmation before dawn. Make sure the package is clean.'" Then he listened for a moment and said, "Understood. I'll update the real boss." Ethan went still. "The real boss," he said. That's what he said. Not his boss, not the board. The real boss. Like there was a distinction he was being careful about. Ethan absorbed that. Daniel was not the top of this. He had suspected it. The scale of the operation, the resources deployed, the level of access required. But hearing it stated so plainly, even in Lena's carefully reconstructed account, made something click into alignment that had been slightly off-center all night. Daniel was loyal to someone who operated above him and above the visible machinery of this conspiracy, someone for whom the phrase, "the real boss," was not a figure of speech, but a genuine acknowledgement of a chain of command, and that someone wanted confirmation before dawn, which meant they were running out of time on a schedule Ethan had not fully understood until this moment. He pressed himself against the wall and thought. Somewhere in the house, boots were sweeping another corridor. Somewhere in a boardroom or a private residence or a car moving through the night, a person he had almost certainly trusted was waiting for word that Ethan Caldwell was no longer a problem. And Daniel, for all his competence and all his betrayal, was ultimately the instrument, not the hand that held it. "We need to get to the safe room," Ethan said. Lena looked at him steadily. "You have one." "Sub-level, behind the wine storage. Daniel knows it exists, but the override system for it runs on an isolated circuit I had installed separately, off the main security network entirely. He can breach it eventually, but not immediately." "How long would it hold?" "Long enough," he said. "There's an encrypted drive in there. I put it together 2 years ago, after the takeover attempt. Company data, board communications, financial documentation, contingency files. If what's happening tonight is connected to the board, the documentation in that drive may tell us who." She nodded once, without asking whether he was certain, without checking whether the plan had risks he hadn't accounted for. She had been making fast decisions all night on incomplete information, and she had been right every time. They went back the way they came, but the route back was not the route they had used coming in. The sweep had advanced since they entered the utility room, and Lena adjusted without hesitating, taking them through the east utility passage rather than doubling back toward the mechanical wing. They were moving through the narrow corridor between the laundry junction and the storage access when she stopped him with a hand on his arm. Ahead of them, Barely 20 feet, a figure was moving away from them down the corridor. One of the armed men, conducting his section check with a methodical back-and-forth pattern. He hadn't seen them. He was moving away. But the corridor had only one direction that didn't dead end, and that direction was through the space the figure currently occupied. Ethan started to move forward. Lena stopped him again. She stepped sideways to the laundry junction doorway, reached inside without looking, and found the handle of the large rolling supply cart that lived just inside the door. The one loaded with cleaning materials, heavy enough to make noise, mobile enough to send rolling down a hard floor with a single firm push. She looked at Ethan, angled her head toward the far end of the junction, the opposite direction from where they needed to go, and raised her eyebrows. He understood. She pushed the cart. It rolled. It clattered. But in the silence of the corridor, it was enormous, a cascade of noise that immediately drew the armed figure's attention. He spun, raised his equipment, and moved fast toward the source of the sound, away from them, away from the direction of the sub-level stairs. They were past the junction and into the stairwell before he reached the far end of the junction to find nothing but a cart and an empty floor. Ethan thought, as they descended, that he had hired security professionals for 6 years who would not have thought of that. At the base of the stairwell, they were briefly separated when a second figure came through the lower corridor door without warning. Ethan pressed into an alcove on the left side of the stairwell base. Lena was already through the corridor door on the right, moving fast and quiet. The figure passed within 4 feet of Ethan, close enough that he could hear the man breathing, close enough that a single involuntary sound would have ended everything. He stood absolutely still and did not make one. The figure moved on. He came through the corridor door. Lena was waiting at the far end, and the look she gave him when he appeared was the specific look of someone who has been counting seconds and is relieved to stop counting. They did not speak. They moved to the wine storage. The safe room was exactly where Ethan had said it was, behind the wine storage, concealed behind a false wall section that responded to a specific tactile sequence rather than a key card or a biometric, because Ethan had specifically wanted something that couldn't be overridden by any system Daniel could access. He pressed the sequence. The wall panel shifted, swung inward, and they stepped through into a room the size of a large walk-in closet, fitted with a narrow desk, a backup power unit, a small isolated terminal, and a steel cabinet bolted to the wall. The door sealed behind them. Lena looked around the room with the particular expression of someone cataloging its dimensions and exits simultaneously, even when the exit count was exactly 1. "How long before he finds a way through?" she asked. "He knows this room exists. He doesn't know the access sequence. I never told him, and it's not in any system document he would have access to. But Daniel is resourceful." Ethan moved to the steel cabinet and pressed his thumb to the lock. It opened. Inside, among other materials, was the encrypted drive. He'll find a workaround. An hour? Maybe less. Then we work fast. He connected the drive to the isolated terminal. The decryption protocol was slow. The files were layered, and the terminal was not a high-performance machine. While it ran, he told her more about what the drive contained. Communications captured during the hostile takeover attempt 2 years ago, financial anomalies his forensic accountant had flagged but never been able to fully trace, board communications that had struck him at the time as subtly coordinated in ways he couldn't prove. "You kept all of that," she said. "I kept everything I couldn't explain." He watched the decryption progress on the screen. "I told myself it was contingency planning. Now I think I kept it because some part of me knew this wasn't over." The terminal chimed. The files opened. He began working through them systematically. Financial first, because financial records left the least room for interpretation. What he found in the first 10 minutes was enough to make his jaw tighten. Money moving through subsidiary accounts in patterns that looked, on the surface, like ordinary intercompany transfers, but resolved, when you traced them far enough, into a pattern of value being quietly redirected toward a holding structure he did not recognize. A holding structure that had been established 18 months ago and had been receiving incremental transfers ever since. He searched the holding structure's registration documents. The registered beneficial owner was a name he recognized immediately. Victoria Hale. He said the name out loud before he meant to. Lena looked up from the adjacent files she had been scanning. "Well, Victoria Hale," she repeated, not as a question. "She's on your board." "She's been on my board for 9 years. She was one of the first people who believed in this company when it was still regional. She mentored me." He stopped. The word felt wrong in his mouth now, naive almost, the vocabulary of a person who had not yet understood what he was looking at. "She was the one who recommended Daniel Reeves to me." Lena held his gaze. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. Something moved in her expression, though, not surprise, but a kind of quiet recognition. He noticed it. "You know her," he said. "I've heard her name," Lena said carefully. "When she's visited for events, the conversation among certain guests, the kind who don't lower their voices around staff, has never been flattering. Not about her character. About her record." She paused. "One man, at the winter dinner 2 years ago, said she had never lost a power play. He said it like a compliment, but the woman next to him looked uncomfortable, like there was something specific behind it that she didn't want to elaborate on in public." She met Ethan's eyes. "I didn't know what it meant at the time." He turned back to the screen and kept reading, because reading was the thing he could do right now that was not the other thing, which was sitting with the full weight of what Victoria Hale represented. Not just a board member who had turned, someone who had been at his table, who had called him on his birthday, who had sat beside him at his father's memorial service 4 years ago and said things that made him feel less alone. Someone he had trusted not strategically, but personally. The kind of trust that has no protocol and no safety measure. The kind you extend to the very small number of people you believe have earned it. That trust had been the tool she used to place Daniel. Once Daniel was inside, everything Ethan had built in response to the first attack became the weapon used against him in the second. He kept reading. He did not allow himself to stop. The communications file was worse. There were exchanges, encrypted originally, but the encryption had been of a type that Ethan's forensic team had cracked during the takeover investigation 2 years ago and filed as a capability in his contingency archive. The messages were between Daniel and an address that resolved, through a chain of relays, to a private server registered under a shell entity that owned, among other assets, a property in Victoria Hale's name. The messages were careful. They were written by people who understood operational security. But careful communication still contained content, and the content, across dozens of exchanges over 18 months, assembled into something unmistakable. Victoria had not decided to move against him recently. She had been planning this from the moment she recommended Daniel for the position. The recommendation itself had been the first move, placing her instrument inside Ethan's innermost layer of protection, giving him administrative authority over the very systems that were now being used against their owner. She had been patient. She had been methodical. She had sat across from Ethan at board meetings and offered counsel and expressed concern and congratulated him on acquisitions she was already planning to absorb. And she had done all of it with a composure that he had interpreted as wisdom and that he now understood as the composure of someone who had already decided how the story ended. And then Lena said, "Look at this." She had opened a different section of the archive, board communications from 3 years back, before any of this had been set in motion, predating even the first hostile takeover attempt. She was pointing at a name in a chain of correspondence. The name was not one Ethan recognized directly, but it was cross-referenced in the document to a corporate entity he did recognize, a private equity group that had been one of the primary vehicles used in the hostile takeover attempt 2 years ago. She was connected to the first attempt too, Lena said quietly. Ethan stared at the screen. The hostile takeover 2 years ago, the thing that had changed him, that had installed the paranoia and the protocols and the rebuilt security infrastructure, and Daniel Reeves, had not been a rival consortium acting independently. Victoria had been connected to it. She had not been the architect of that first attempt, but she had been aware of it. She had possibly facilitated it, at some remove, testing the defenses, mapping the vulnerabilities, learning how Ethan responded under pressure. And then, when that failed, she had shifted strategy. She had moved from external pressure to internal installation. She had recommended Daniel, given Ethan time to trust him completely, and then, slowly, systematically, over 18 months, Daniel had been dismantling the very thing Ethan had built in response to the first attack. She learned from the first attempt, Ethan said. She used it, Lena corrected, gently but precisely. She used your response to it. The fact that you brought in Daniel, that was her move, not yours. He understood then, fully and without remainder, the complete architecture of what had been done to him. The first attempt had not been a failure. It had been a probe, and his response to it had handed Victoria exactly the access point she needed. He sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of it, the way it reshaped the last 2 years of his life into something that had been observed and manipulated from a distance by someone he had never once stopped trusting. Then the terminal flickered. A warning message appeared in the corner of the screen. External access attempt, isolated circuit. It flickered again. Then a second line appeared, breach in progress. He found it, Lena said, faster than I expected. She was already thinking. He could see it in the quality of her stillness, not frozen, but gathered, the way a person gathers before a decision that can only go one direction. We can't stay, she said, and we can't run blind. She looked at him with an expression that was calm in the way that real calm was calm. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity despite it. There's one thing that makes all of this stop. Not getting out of the house. Not calling the police from somewhere outside and waiting for them to sort through it. She paused. If what's on that drive gets out, publicly, completely, to media and law enforcement simultaneously, then Victoria loses every advantage she has. She can't suppress it. She can't buy it back. She can't make it disappear. The moment it's public, she becomes the subject of the story instead of the author of it. Ethan looked at her. You want to broadcast it, he said. I want to upload it. There's a difference. Broadcasting can be interrupted. A distributed upload to multiple recipients, press contacts, federal agencies, international financial regulators, that's not something you stop by cutting a single line. She met his eyes steadily. You have the contacts. I'm assuming the drive has the documentation. The mansion's central server hub has the bandwidth and the external connection. If we can reach it and initiate the upload before Daniel completes the breach. Daniel will try to stop us. Yes, she said. He will. From outside the safe room, something impacted the wall. A testing blow, methodical. To someone working systematically through the section of false wall, trying to find the seam by sound. Then another blow. Then a third, closer to the latch point, more accurate. Daniel had not known the access sequence, but Daniel was a man who solved problems he couldn't unlock by finding a different entry point. He had been doing exactly that all night, all year, for as long as Ethan had known him. Then, from further away, but carried clearly through the insulated door, Daniel's voice, no longer broadcasting through the house system, but physically present, standing somewhere in the wine storage on the other side of that wall, close enough that the particular flatness in his tone came through intact. You should have stayed out of this, Lena. His voice was composed. It was the voice of a man who had assessed the new configuration of the situation and had determined that the outcome remained in his favor. He was addressing her specifically, not Ethan, not both of them, her alone. She was the variable. She was the reason the plan had not executed cleanly, the thread that had come loose from a fabric otherwise tightly woven, and he wanted her to understand that he understood that. He was naming her because naming someone was a way of telling them they had been seen, not overlooked, not incidental. Seen, and that being seen in his world was not a compliment. Lena looked at the wall for a moment. Something passed across her face that was not fear and not defiance, something quieter and more settled than either. Then she looked at Ethan. "The server hub," she said. "Right now." He copied the drive's core files to a portable format, pocketed it, and they moved toward the door. Whatever came next, they were not hiding anymore. The safe room wall held for another 40 seconds after they left it. They heard the breach behind them, a sharp structural crack, then the sound of the false panel giving way, as they were already moving through the wine storage and into the sub-level corridor. Daniel was through, which meant the clock had just become something they could hear ticking. Lena did not run. Running in a house full of trained men with clear sight lines was how you got caught. She moved fast, deliberately, keeping them to the wall, using the corridor's ambient shadows where they existed and the stored knowledge of every camera position, every guard rotation, every structural quirk of this building that she had accumulated over 2 years of showing up and paying attention. Ethan stayed close and matched her pace and did not second-guess her direction once. The mansion's central server hub was on the ground floor in the east wing, a room that had been purpose-built during the estate's last major renovation, housed behind a reinforced door, climate-controlled, running the primary network infrastructure for the property. It was also, Ethan knew, the room Daniel had used to initiate the security override at the start of the night, which meant it was likely guarded. 2 of them, minimum, he said, low, as they reached the base of the east stairwell. Daniel won't leave the hub unprotected. I know. Lena paused at the stairwell door, listening. But there's a maintenance access panel in the east corridor ceiling, directly above the hub's exterior wall. It connects to the conduit run for the network cabling. The panel is standard ceiling tile, no lock. She glanced at him. If one of us goes through the conduit and comes out through the hub's interior panel, the guards are watching a door that isn't opening. He looked at her for a moment. You've been in that conduit. I've cleaned the access panel twice. I know where it leads. That was the thing about her knowledge. It was not theoretical. It was not mapped. It was earned, physically, through repetition and presence. She knew this house the way no blueprint ever could, because she had been inside its walls and above its ceilings and behind its fixtures, month after month, doing the work that made the visible parts of the house function. I'll go through, he said. She shook her head once. The conduit runs aren't wide. I know the exact path. You don't. She met his eyes and held them. I go through. You draw the guards away from the hub door. Make noise at the east corridor junction, enough to pull at least one of them out. When I'm inside, I'll start the upload. You get in through the door once their attention is split. It was a good plan. It was, in fact, the only workable plan given what they had. He didn't like the part where she was alone in a ceiling conduit above a room full of people who had been sent to kill him, but he also understood that his preference was not the relevant variable right now. How long do you need? He asked. To initiate the upload. 2 minutes, maybe less. Wait, the drive files are compressed. The hub's external bandwidth is substantial. She paused. Staying alive long enough for the upload to complete is the harder part. I'll handle that. She looked at him with an expression that was not skepticism exactly, more the look of someone recalibrating a prior assessment upward. Then she moved. They split at the east corridor junction, Lena going up through the maintenance access panel she found and opened in under 30 seconds, pulling herself into the conduit space with a practiced efficiency that told him she had planned this, at least partially, before she said it. He watched the ceiling tile close above her and turned toward the junction. He gave her 45 seconds. Then he picked up a decorative bronze piece from the hall console table beside him and threw it hard against the far wall of the east corridor. The sound it made was substantial, a loud metallic collision that rang through the corridor and was impossible to ignore. He did not wait to see the response. He pressed himself into the junction alcove and counted. 4 seconds. Then boots, 2 sets, moving fast from the direction of the hub, coming toward the noise source. He stayed flat in the alcove as they passed within 10 feet of him, both focused on the far end of the corridor where the bronze piece had landed. He moved. The hub door had been left on a slow automatic close, not locked, just releasing, the latch not yet engaged. He caught it before it sealed and slipped through. While the room was smaller than it looked on the estate schematics, dense with server racks and cable management, the air cool and recycled, humming with the low-frequency sound of running equipment. There was a third guard inside, positioned at the primary console, and he was already turning, already responding to the commotion in the corridor, hand moving toward his radio. Ethan reached him first. It was not elegant. He was not trained for this the way the men Daniel had brought were trained, but he was larger than most people expected for a man who spent most of his visible life in boardrooms, and the element of surprise, a man walking through the hub door when the guard expected his colleagues to come back from the corridor, was worth more than technique in a small room with nowhere to retreat. The struggle was brief and decisive. Ethan put the guard down, hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline spike of it, and turned to find Lena already at the primary console, the ceiling access panel hanging open above her head, a cable from the portable drive connected to the hub's external uplink interface. She was typing. 40 seconds, she said, without looking up. He crossed to the door and put his back against the wall beside it, listening to the corridor. The 2 guards who had gone toward the noise were coming back. He could hear their boots, slower now, the urgency gone, the noise source identified as nothing, and the alert downgraded. They would reach the hub door in under a minute. Lena. I know, she said, still typing. 30 seconds. Outside, the boots slowed. A voice, one of the 2 guards, speaking into his radio. Hub. Confirm status. A pause where the answer should have come from inside the room. Another pause. Hub. Confirm. The door opened. Ethan held his ground as the first guard came through. The second one was directly behind him, and the moment the first guard processed that the room was occupied by the wrong people, everything compressed into a few seconds of controlled chaos. Shouting, movement, Ethan absorbing a blow across the shoulder that sent him into the server rack and bounced him off it, reaching for the guard's arm to redirect the next one. Upload initiated, Lena said from the console. Her voice was completely level. Then the door slammed open from the outside, not the guard's side, not the corridor, the emergency exit on the opposite wall, the one that connected the hub to the external equipment bay. Daniel walked in. He was alone. He had sent the others ahead, Ethan realized, and come through the back access himself, because Daniel always had a secondary route. He had built this house's security layout. He had known the back access was there, and he had used it, and now he was standing in the center of the hub with the particular calm of a man who believed he had already won and was simply arriving for the conclusion. He looked at the console. He looked at the upload indicator on the screen, the progress bar climbing. He looked at Lena. "Step away from the console," he said. Not loud, not urgent, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it. Lena did not move. "Ethan." Daniel shifted his attention. "This ends one of 2 ways. You stop the upload, and we have a conversation about what comes next. Or you don't. And things become considerably worse for people who don't need to be involved in this." He let the implication settle. "She doesn't need to be here for what happens after. Walk away from this now, and she walks out." Ethan stood up from where the collision with the server rack had put him. His shoulder ached in a way that would matter more later. He looked at Daniel, at the face of a man he had trusted for 6 years, standing in the room he had built, having spent a year quietly preparing to kill him, and felt something that was not anger exactly, though it wore anger's shape. It was the feeling of looking clearly at something you had refused to see, and finally seeing it completely. "She's already involved," Ethan said. "She's been involved since the moment she decided not to let you win." Lena spoke without turning from the console.
Don't make the deal, Ethan." "I'm not." Daniel moved. He was fast, faster than the guards had been, the speed of someone with real training rather than the procedural competence of hired security. He crossed the room in 2 strides toward the console, and Lena stepped back from it and to the side, not retreating but creating space, and the distraction of her movement, small, deliberate, gave Ethan the half-second he needed. He hit Daniel from the side. The impact put them both into the far server rack, and equipment shuddered, and something in the rack above them sparked. A connection pulled loose, a voltage surge, the room's lighting flickering once, sharply. They went to the floor, and for a moment it was simply 2 people, and none of the structures of authority or hierarchy or 6 years of professional relationship mattered at all. Only the immediate physical reality of the room and the ground and the effort of stopping someone from reaching a console. Daniel was stronger. He was regaining position. Ethan held on and bought seconds the only way available. Lena said, "It's done." The room went very still. Not physically still. Daniel was still moving, Ethan still holding. But the quality of the moment changed. The upload indicator on the console was at 100%. The data had gone out to media contacts, to federal law enforcement, to financial regulatory bodies across multiple jurisdictions, distributed, redundant, irretrievable. Daniel stopped. He looked at the screen. He was still for several seconds, and in those seconds, the entire weight of what had just happened seemed to arrive for him in increments. The loss of timeline, the loss of operational control, the loss of every carefully constructed layer of deniability that had made this plan viable, and beneath all of that, the understanding that Victoria Hale, who had built this operation on the premise that silence could be maintained, was now looking at the same data Ethan was, delivered to every desk that mattered. "You don't even know what you've just started," Daniel said. His voice was still controlled. But it was the control of a man holding something together that was already broken, and both of them could hear the difference. The first siren reached the estate 11 minutes later. The law enforcement response was not quiet. Federal agents arrived first, having been among the recipients of the data upload and having acted on it with a speed that told Ethan, later, that some of what was in those files had connected to investigations already underway, threads that had existed without context, waiting for something to pull them into a legible shape. The local police came minutes behind them. Then, before the first hour was finished, vehicles without markings that belonged to agencies whose names Ethan would not learn until the following week. The mansion's exterior filled with light, real light, investigative light, the kind that does not flicker or dim, and the men Daniel had positioned throughout the house were located, contained, and taken into custody in sequence, each of them finding that the operation they had been hired into was no longer being managed from above. Daniel was taken from the server hub without resistance. He had sat in the corner of the room after his final words and said nothing else, not to Ethan, not to Lena, not to the agents who came through the door. He had looked at the floor with the expression of a man doing an internal accounting that was not going to balance, and he had let it proceed. Ethan gave his initial statement in the estate's main hall, standing beneath the chandelier that was finally lit again, surrounded by the organized activity of people who had arrived to take over a situation that he and Lena had held together, barely, repeatedly, by the thinnest available margins, through an entire night. He was asked more than once how he had survived. Each time he said the same thing. He said she saw it before anyone else did, and she acted. Victoria Hale was arrested attempting to board a private flight from a regional airfield outside of Chicago, approximately 4 hours after the data upload completed.
She had moved fast, faster than Ethan expected, which suggested she had a contingency already ready, which suggested she had known failure was always possible. The evidence connecting her to Daniel, to the conspiracy, and to the financial structures built to absorb Ethan's company post-removal was extensive and unambiguous. Her legal team was retained before she landed. Her board position was suspended the same morning by emergency vote. By evening, 3 other companies in whose structures her name appeared in similar configurations had opened their own reviews. The investigations that followed were long and complicated and reached further than Ethan had fully anticipated. To Daniel's reference to the real boss had not been rhetorical. Victoria, it emerged, had her own chain of accountability, investors, and partners who had structured their exposure carefully enough that the first wave of arrests did not reach them. The story had layers that took months to surface, but the upload had given investigators what they needed to begin pulling at the right threads, and threads, once pulled, did not stop unraveling on their own. In the days after the night, Ethan moved through the required processes: interviews, documentation, legal consultations, board meetings, restructured around the sudden absence of a member who had been, until 48 hours prior, one of the most respected voices at the table. He did all of it with the efficiency that was native to him, and he did it from a position that felt different from any position he had occupied before. Not weaker, clearer. He had spent 2 years constructing systems designed to prevent betrayal. He had built walls and protocols and redundancies, and the thing that had actually saved him was none of those. It was a woman who showed up to a job every day and looked at the world around her with complete, unsentimental attention, and who made a decision in a dark hallway, alone, with no backup, with no guarantee that the person she was protecting deserved it, to act. Lena's role became public through the coverage. Not immediately, she did not choose to speak to media, and Ethan did not speak about her without her knowledge. But the nature of what had happened was not containable, and once the broad shape of the night was reported, the specific detail of who had first detected the threat, who had hidden alone in that house for 2 hours, who had guided the escape and initiated the upload, all of it became part of the record. People who had thought of her one way, if they had thought of her at all, were now being asked to think of her differently. The adjustment seemed to cost them more than it cost her. She did not seem particularly interested in what was made of it. He met with her formally 9 days after the night in a conference room that was a long way from a dark service corridor. He had prepared what he wanted to say and found, when she sat across from him, that the prepared version was the wrong version. So he said the true version instead. "I employed you for 2 years, he said, "and I never asked what you thought about anything. And you knew things about my house and about the people in it that my entire security infrastructure missed. That's on me, not as an employer, as a person." She looked at him with the calm directness that he had come to understand was simply how she occupied space in the world. "You're trying to apologize," she said, "partly. And partly you're offering me something." "Yes," he said, "a role, overseeing internal integrity and security reform across the company. Not a courtesy title, a real function with real authority, reporting directly to me, with the mandate to build exactly the kind of internal observation system that should have caught this before it reached the point it reached." She was quiet for a moment. "Why not head of security?" she asked. But not with ambition, with genuine curiosity about how he had arrived at the specific offer he had made. "Because head of security is a role people already understand," he said. "They'd place you inside an existing frame. What I'm asking you to do doesn't have a frame yet. I want you to build one." She considered that seriously, the way she considered everything, not looking for the flattering interpretation, looking for the accurate one. "I want it in writing," she said. "Scope, authority, reporting structure, budget, and independence clause." "Already drafted," he said. A pause, then something that was almost a smile, though it carried more complexity than the word usually implied. "You planned ahead." "I'm learning," she accepted. The weeks that followed were the beginning of something that was harder to name than a recovery, because recovery implied returning to a prior state, and neither of them were returning anywhere. The company was restructured around the absence of compromised board members and the presence of external investigators. New protocols were built from scratch, not by a single trusted authority this time, but through a layered system with no single point of failure. In the spring, months after that night, Ethan walked the ground floor of the estate in the early morning. The renovation had been completed, the service corridor repainted, the malfunctioning camera replaced, and the whole system audited and rebuilt by an independent firm. The passage was lit now, properly, evenly, with fixtures that did not flicker. He stood in the spot where she had grabbed him. It was quiet. The house was staffed again, normal, functioning. Outside, the grounds were beginning to show the first green of the season. Through the window at the far end of the corridor, the morning light was coming in flat and clean. He stood there for a while. He thought about the number in the Singapore slide that had sent him home early. He thought about the gut feeling he had been unable to name or justify, the paranoia that had cost him sleep and ease and the uncomplicated trust of someone who hadn't yet been tried. He had resented that paranoia sometimes, had considered it a tax levied by the hostile takeover on everything that came after. He understood now that it was not paranoia. It was the part of him that had been paying attention when the rest of him was looking elsewhere. The part that noticed the small wrong things and refused to let them settle. That night, in the dark, it had brought him home, and she had been waiting. He thought about what everyone had believed in all the years she had been present in his household and invisible to the people who filled the visible spaces of his life. They had seen a maid. They had seen a function, cleaning, maintenance, the background work that made everything else possible. They had looked at her and seen the role and not the person inside it. He had done the same. She had seen everything clearly and said nothing to the people who would not have listened and acted decisively the moment acting became possible. He turned from the corridor and walked back through the house. He had a meeting in an hour. Lena would be in the room, not serving it, not maintaining it, but sitting at the table where the decisions got made, with the authority he had put in writing and the mandate she had already begun to exercise with the same quiet thoroughness she had always applied to everything she touched. Everyone had thought she worked for him. That night, she was the only reason he was still alive. If the people closest to you were the threat, would you have seen it coming, or would you have trusted them right until the end? If this story kept you on edge, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will make you think twice about who's really in the room.